The polished marble floor of Terminal 3 at Kennedy International Airport gleamed under the bright overhead lights, reflecting the hurried silhouettes of travelers as they rushed to their destinations. The Friday evening rush was in full swing, a symphony of rolling luggage, urgent announcements over the PA system, and the constant buzz of thousands of conversations blending together in the cavernous space. Business travelers clutched their briefcases and mobile phones, families corralled excited children, and solo travelers navigated the crowds with practiced efficiency. Amidst this choreographed chaos walked Mr. David Kamau, his pace deliberate and unhurried, a counterpoint to the frantic energy surrounding him. At 76, his tall frame had begun to curve slightly with age, but he still carried himself with the quiet dignity that had become his hallmark over decades of building one of America's most successful airlines. The rhythmic tap of his mahogany cane on the floor created a metronome-like beat that helped him maintain his steady pace through the terminal. The cane itself was a work of art, hand-carved Kenyan ironwood, topped with a brass handle shaped like a small bird in flight. It had been a gift from his late wife, Amara, on their 40th wedding anniversary, just 2 years before cancer took her. "To remind you always to soar," she had told him. He'd used it every day since, even when his arthritis wasn't particularly troublesome. Mr. Kamau wore a simple gray cardigan over a crisp white shirt, khaki slacks, and well-polished but modest brown loafers. The only hint of luxury was the vintage watch on his wrist, Patek Philippe passed down from his father, who had once worked as a janitor at this very airport. He carried a weather leather messenger bag slung across his body, containing a dog-eared paperback, his reading glasses, and the company reports he planned to review during his flight to Chicago for tomorrow's board meeting. As he approached Gate 12, where Meridian Airways Flight 237 to Chicago O'Hare would soon begin boarding, Mr. Kamau paused to check the monitor. The flight was on time, 8:45 p.m. departure. He had arrived early, as was his habit. Punctuality, he often told young executives, is the courtesy of kings and the obligation of businessmen. He shifted his weight to reach for his boarding pass, and in that moment his cane caught on a small ridge between two floor panels. The smooth wooden handle slipped from his grasp as arthritis shot a bolt of pain through his fingers. The cane clattered to the ground with a hollow sound that seemed to echo through the terminal, the brass bird catching the overhead light as it fell. Mr. Kamau sighed softly and began to bend down to retrieve it, his knees protesting the movement with sharp complaints that he silently acknowledged but refused to surrender to. Age had taken much from him, but not his self-sufficiency, not yet. But before he could reach the cane, a young flight attendant in a crisp blue Meridian Airways uniform stepped between him and the fallen walking aide. She was in her early 30s, with platinum blonde hair pulled back into a tight, regulation bun, not a strand out of place. Her makeup was impeccable, her posture perfect, the very image of corporate professionalism and efficiency. "Sir," she said, her voice artificially pleasant but loud enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. "This area is for first-class passengers only. The economy boarding area is down at Gate 14. She gestured vaguely behind him, her French manicured hand pointing dismissively toward the other end of the terminal. Mr. Kamau straightened slowly, standing to his full height of 6 feet, though age had curved his shoulders somewhat. He looked at the young woman's name tag, Charlotte Wilson, senior flight attendant, then at her face, noting the cool assessment in her eyes as she took in his modest attire. "My cane," he said quietly, nodding toward the floor where it lay between them. His voice carried the faint melodic cadence of his native Kenya, though he had lived in America for more than 60 years. Charlotte didn't move. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest, her smile never reaching her eyes. She stood like a sentinel, guarding the invisible boundary between the regular boarding area and the plush carpet of the first-class waiting section. "Sir, I need you to move to the appropriate boarding area. This section is reserved for our premium passengers." Her emphasis on premium carried unmistakable implication. Mr. Kamau's gaze drifted from her face to his cane and back again. The pain in his hip was beginning to intensify without the support of his walking aid, but his expression remained placid. "Young lady, I simply need to retrieve my cane. After you move to the correct boarding area, someone can assist you." she replied, her voice rising slightly, as if speaking to someone hard of hearing or difficult to understand. "This is a restricted zone for premium passengers only." By now, the bustling terminal around them had begun to quiet. The confrontation was drawing attention, curious glances from some passengers, uncomfortable looks from others. A businessman lowered his Wall Street Journal. A mother pulled her curious child closer. Two college students exchanged glances and subtly pointed their phones toward the scene. An elderly white couple seated nearby looked on with apparent concern. The woman whispered something to her husband, who frowned and shook his head. Mr. Kamau stood perfectly still, his face betraying no emotion despite the growing discomfort in his joints. He had faced far worse indignities in his life than this. He had built an airline empire from nothing, starting as an immigrant with $240 in his pocket and an engineering degree that American employers had been reluctant to recognize. He had navigated boardroom battles with prejudiced executives and overcome skeptical investors who couldn't imagine a black man at the helm of a major American corporation. This small humiliation was nothing, and yet it was everything, a reminder that no matter how far one climbed, how much one achieved, certain assumptions remained stubbornly in place. "You've just made a serious mistake," Mr. Kamau said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying through the now silent terminal with perfect clarity. David Ngurgir Kamau had lived through far worse confrontations than this. Born in rural Kenya in 1949, he'd grown up watching his country struggle for independence while his father worked 3 jobs to save enough for David's education. As the eldest of 6 children, David had studied by kerosene lamp late into the night, determined to honor his parents' sacrifices. He'd immigrated to America in 1968, arriving in New York during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. With a partial scholarship to Cornell University and fierce determination, he'd worked as a dishwasher, taxi driver, and night security guard simultaneously while pursuing his engineering degree. He graduated with honors in 1972, the same year he became a naturalized citizen. Despite his credentials, he'd faced dozens of rejections from engineering firms, often watching less qualified white graduates receive positions he had been denied. Finally, a small aviation maintenance company in Queens hired him as a junior engineer. Within 3 years, he had revolutionized their maintenance protocols, saving the company millions and earning his first promotion to management. By 1983, after saving every possible penny and convincing 3 former classmates to invest, he founded Horizon Air Freight with 2 small cargo planes flying routes between New York, Chicago, and Atlanta. The early years had been grueling 18-hour days, mortgaging his modest home 3 times to make payroll, and facing constant skepticism from banks and business partners who couldn't see past the color of his skin. Slowly but surely, the company grew. When a regional passenger airline faced bankruptcy in 1991, Kamau took a massive risk, securing financing to acquire it and rebrand. Meridian Airways was born, focusing initially on underserved routes between mid-sized cities. By 2010, after strategic acquisitions of 3 smaller carriers, Meridian had become the 5th largest airline in the United States, with routes spanning the globe and a reputation for exceptional service and reliability. Though he'd stepped down as CEO 5 years ago, he remained chairman of the board, still attending quarterly meetings in person and making major strategic decisions. Worth nearly $2 billion, he lived modestly in the same Brooklyn brownstone he'd purchased 30 years earlier. He still took the subway most days, only using the company car service for airport runs and important meetings. David Kamau had never sought the spotlight. His rare interviews focused on the company, not himself. He funneled much of his wealth back into educational initiatives for underprivileged youth, particularly those interested in aviation and engineering. The Kamau Foundation provided hundreds of scholarships annually, with special emphasis on first-generation college students. His hands, now resting gently on the ticket in his coat pocket, bore the calluses of a man who had built something with his own hands, who had crawled into aircraft engines himself in the early days when they couldn't afford enough mechanics. His eyes, deep brown and lined at the corners, held a patient wisdom that came from decades of navigating corporate America as a black immigrant who had never been given the benefit of the doubt. Mr. Kamau looked at Charlotte Wilson now with those same eyes, not angry, not indignant, but assessing. He had encountered countless Charlotte Wilsons throughout his life. Some had learned. Some never would. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said calmly, his slight Kenyan accent still evident after all these years in America. "I'm a passenger on this flight, and I simply need to retrieve my cane." Charlotte Wilson had been with Meridian Airways for 8 years. She'd started as a gate agent at the Milwaukee Regional Hub, working her way up to senior flight attendant on international routes based out of JFK. She prided herself on efficiency and protocol adherence qualities that had earned her numerous Employee of the Month awards and the respect of her supervisors. Born and raised in a small Wisconsin town, Charlotte had dreamed of traveling the world since childhood. Her parents, her father, a factory foreman, her mother, a school secretary, had rarely ventured beyond the state lines. But Charlotte had set her sights higher. She'd studied hospitality management at a state college, working 3 part-time jobs to afford tuition. The airline industry had seemed glamorous, a pathway to the cosmopolitan life she coveted. The reality had proven more grueling than glamorous, demanding passengers, exhausting turnarounds, nights in airport hotels when flights were delayed. But Charlotte had persevered, finding satisfaction in the procedural perfection she brought to her role. She memorized company policies verbatim, took pride in her immaculate appearance, and approached each day with military precision. To Charlotte, the airline's first-class section represented everything she aspired to: exclusivity, luxury, and status. She protected its boundaries with righteous determination, seeing herself as the guardian of a rarefied space that had to be earned through wealth or achievement. In her mind, first class was reserved for those who looked the part: the well-dressed executives with designer luggage, the celebrities with their entourages, the wealthy who wore their privilege as comfortably as cashmere. She'd worked too hard to let the lines blur between those who belonged in premium sections and those who didn't. It wasn't about race or age, she would have insisted if asked. It was about standards, about respect for the distinctions that gave her profession meaning. When she saw Mr. Kamau approaching elderly, using a cane, dressed in what she registered as ordinary retiree attire, she immediately categorized him. Economy passenger, confused about the boarding areas. Probably needed assistance. Definitely not first-class material. His accent only confirmed her assessment of foreign visitor, likely unfamiliar with American airline protocols. "Sir," Charlotte said, her smile now strained, "I understand you need your cane, but rules are rules. First-class boarding is not for another 20 minutes, and this area needs to remain clear for our premium passengers." She emphasized the word again, as if its repetition might make the concept clearer to him. Her eyes darted to a group of younger passengers watching the scene unfold. One was recording on his phone. Good, she thought. People needed to see that rules were enforced equally, regardless of age or circumstance. Too many people these days expected special treatment. "If you'd like assistance moving to the correct boarding area, I'd be happy to call for a wheelchair," she added, her tone suggesting this was a generous accommodation. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" Charlotte asked, extending her hand with a slight edge to her voice that suggested she was humoring him rather than taking his claims seriously. Mr. Kamau reached into his pocket and produced a first-class ticket. He handed it to her with a steady hand, his expression remaining neutral despite the growing audience around them. The ticket was slightly worn at the edges. He'd checked it several times before leaving home, a habit from his early days in America when he'd been terrified of making any mistake that might single him out. Charlotte examined the ticket with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it over as if looking for signs of forgery. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the seat assignment Tonier, the premier spot in first class, reserved for Meridian's most valued passengers, but she quickly composed herself. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, quickly replaced by suspicion. "And may I see some identification as well?" she asked, her tone suggesting this was an unusual request she felt compelled to make given the circumstances. The surrounding passengers shifted uncomfortably. An older white woman in a business suit frowned, while a young interracial couple exchanged troubled glances. A black businessman in an expensive suit looked up from his laptop, his expression darkening as he observed the interaction. "Is this standard procedure for all your first-class passengers?" Mr. Kamau asked softly, though he already knew the answer. He had flown his own airline countless times, often anonymously, observing how operations functioned when staff didn't know the founder was among them. Charlotte's cheeks flushed slightly. "I'm simply following protocol, sir. We need to verify that the person presenting the ticket is the ticketed passenger." "I see," Mr. Kamau replied. "And do you verify every passenger's identity at this preliminary stage, before they've even entered the boarding area?" Charlotte's flush deepened. "When necessary." "I understand," Mr. Kamau said, nodding slowly. "When necessary." He slowly reached for his wallet, the movement deliberate as his arthritis made fine motor skills challenging. He removed his driver's license and a faded Meridian Airways VIP membership card that he rarely used, but always carried a reminder of the early days when he designed the loyalty program himself. He passed them to Charlotte without comment. Charlotte studied the ID, then looked at Mr. Kamau's face, then back at the ID. The name stared back at her. David Ngurgir Kamau. Her lips pursed into a thin line as she compared the photo to the man standing before her. The resemblance was clear, though the ID photo was several years younger. "This says David Kamau," she stated, emphasizing the surname as if testing its authenticity. "Are you related to someone at Meridian Airways?" Her tone suggested she thought he might have borrowed someone else's ticket, or was using a family connection to secure a seat he didn't deserve. "You could say that," Mr. Kamau replied softly, a hint of weariness in his voice. He had spent decades answering variations of this question, people unable to imagine that his success and his name could authentically belong together. Charlotte handed back his documents with visible reluctance. "Well, regardless of how you obtained this ticket, Mr. Kamau, first-class passengers typically dress appropriately for the experience." Her eyes swept critically over his modest attire, lingering on his worn leather messenger bag. "And our premium boarding hasn't begun yet. You'll need to wait." His cane still lay on the floor between them, a physical manifestation of the dignity she was denying him. "Young lady, Mr. Kamau said, his voice remaining calm, but taking on a deeper resonance that made several nearby passengers look up. "I simply need my cane, which you are currently standing over. Then, I will gladly wait wherever is appropriate." Charlotte's face flushed slightly, a mixture of embarrassment and indignation crossing her features. She stepped aside, but didn't bend to retrieve the cane. "Our premium customers normally travel with assistance for this sort of thing," she remarked loud enough for others to hear, doubling down rather than acknowledging her error. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Is she serious?" Another voice, "I can't believe this." Mr. Kamau looked at his cane on the floor, then at Charlotte, then at the growing audience around them. With deliberate slowness, he began to lower himself, one hand braced against his knee, the other reaching for the cane that represented not just physical support, but the independence he had fought so hard to maintain. The terminal seemed to hold its collective breath as the elderly man, worth billions but dressed like anyone's grandfather, bent to retrieve his own cane because a young flight attendant deemed him unworthy of basic courtesy. The crowd watching the scene unfold had grown considerably. What had begun as a few curious onlookers had swelled to nearly 30 people, forming a loose semicircle around the confrontation. Some passengers filmed discreetly on their phones, angling their devices as if checking messages while actually recording the interaction. Others pretended to be occupied with their devices while stealing furtive glances at the unfolding drama. A businessman in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably, recognition dawning on his face as he studied Mr. Kamau more closely. He was Jeffrey Lawson, CEO of a tech company that had recently signed a major corporate travel contract with Meridian Airways. He had met Mr. Kamau briefly at a charity gala 6 months earlier. Lawson leaned toward his colleague and whispered urgently, "That's David Kamau, founder of Meridian." His colleague's eyebrows shot up. "The billionaire? Are you sure?" "Positive," Lawson muttered, his expression a mixture of disbelief and second-hand embarrassment. "I met him at the Climate Action Fund dinner. That flight attendant has no idea who she's talking to." A young mother pulled her curious 8-year-old daughter closer, whispering in her ear about respect and dignity. The girl's eyes were wide as she watched Mr. Four. Kamau slowly bending toward his cane, her young mind processing the injustice more clearly than many adults present. Two college students, one black and one Asian, exchanged glances of shared understanding. The black student shook his head slightly. "Same story, different day," he murmured, and his friend nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a pattern they had witnessed too many times. A flight crew member, Sophia Martinez, a veteran flight attendant with 20 years at Meridian, walked by and slowed her pace, watching with growing concern. She seemed about to approach but hesitated, uncertain of the situation and Charlotte's apparent authority in handling it. She made eye contact with Mr. Kamau briefly, an apologetic look crossing her features. "This is shameful," an elderly white woman muttered to her husband, who nodded in agreement. "In my day, we would have helped him immediately." "Times change, Eleanor," her husband replied quietly, "not always for the better." A young black woman standing nearby caught Mr. Kamau's eye and moved forward as if to help, but he gave her a small, barely perceptible shake of his head. This was not the first indignity he had faced in his long life, and he would handle it his way. The young woman understood instantly and stepped back, respecting his choice even as her jaw clenched in controlled anger. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, her thumbs flying across the screen as she documented what she was witnessing. Two teenage girls exchanged troubled glances, one of them typing furiously on her phone. Later, her post would be shared thousands of times. "Just witnessed the most disgusting display of disrespect at JFK. This flight attendant has no idea who she's messing with. Comma respect. Meridian Airways." A man in first-class lounge attire pressed chinos and a polo shirt with the Meridian Airways logo watched with growing alarm from the edge of the gate area. He was Michael Chen, the terminal's operations manager, who had stopped by to check on the evening's flight status. He recognized Mr. Kamau immediately. His photograph hung in the airline's headquarters lobby and pulled out his phone, rapidly typing a message to his supervisor. "Potential PR disaster unfolding at Gate 12. Chairman Kamau being disrespected by FA. Intervene?" As Mr. Kamau continued his slow descent toward his cane, the crowd's whispers grew louder, the collective discomfort palpable in the air. Charlotte seemed oblivious to the shifting mood, still standing with arms crossed, watching Mr. Kamau with transparent impatience. An older black janitor pushing a cleaning cart nearby slowed his pace, his eyes taking in the scene with the weariness of someone who had seen this story play out countless times. He made brief eye contact with Mr. C. Lashwarney. Kamau's silent moment of shared understanding between two men who had navigated a world that constantly underestimated them. As Mr. Kamau's fingers were inches from reaching his cane, a well-dressed woman in her 50s approached from the direction of the first-class lounge. She wore a tailored navy suit with a Meridian Airways executive pin on her blazer lapel. Her confident stride and alert eyes marked her as someone accustomed to solving problems quickly and efficiently. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a hot knife through butter. "Is there a problem here?" Charlotte straightened immediately, her customer service smile returning as she recognized Margaret Reynolds, Meridian's Vice President of Customer Experience. "No problem, Ms. Reynolds. Just explaining our boarding procedures to this gentleman." Ms. Reynolds looked at Mr. Kamau, who had paused in his effort to retrieve his cane. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by alarm. She had started at Meridian 20 years ago as his executive assistant before working her way up through the ranks. "Mr. Kamau? David Kamau?" she asked, her voice rising slightly in surprise. She hadn't expected to see the founder here. He typically used the private executive entrance when traveling. Mr. Kamau nodded once, the corner of his mouth lifting in a small wry smile. "Hello, Margaret. It's been a while." Without hesitation, Ms. Reynolds bent down and retrieved the cane, handing it to him with deep respect. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't realize you were visiting this terminal today. We would have prepared a proper welcome." Charlotte's smile faltered as she looked back and forth between them. "You know this passenger?" Ms. Reynolds gave her a sharp look. "Know him? Aye." She stopped herself, glancing at Mr. Kamau as if seeking permission to reveal his identity. She knew his preference for anonymity when traveling, his dislike of special treatment. Mr. Kamau adjusted his grip on the cane, the brass bird catching the light as he tested its weight. "It's quite all right, Margaret. Miss Wilson here was just doing her job, very thoroughly." There was no malice in his tone, but the gentle emphasis on thoroughly spoke volumes. Charlotte's expression shifted from confusion to the first glimmerings of concern. She straightened her uniform jacket unconsciously, suddenly aware that something was very wrong with the situation. A man in the crowd suddenly snapped his fingers in recognition. "Wait, Kamau? As in the Kamau terminal at O'Hare?" Whispers rippled through the gathered spectators. Someone else said, "Isn't there a Kamau engineering building at Cornell?" A woman in business attire nodded, "And the Kamau STEM Academy in Brooklyn." Charlotte's complexion had begun to pale, her eyes darting between Mr. Kamau and Ms. Reynolds as the pieces started falling into place. The perfect posture she had maintained throughout the confrontation began to sag slightly. "I've seen him in Forbes," someone murmured. "He's on the billionaires list." "Sir," Charlotte began, her voice losing its authoritative edge, "if there's been a misunderstanding." "There certainly has been," a new voice boomed from behind them. The crowd parted as Captain James Foster approached, his commanding presence immediately changing the dynamic of the gathering. At 64, Foster was a legend at Meridian Airways, former Air Force pilot who had been one of Mr. Kamau's first hires when the company expanded into passenger service. Captain James Foster, a veteran pilot with salt and pepper hair and the commanding presence that came with 30 years in the cockpit, strode toward them. His uniform was impeccable, his captain's hat tucked under one arm, his 4 gold stripes gleaming on his sleeves. He had been preparing for pre-flight checks when an operations manager had alerted him to the situation unfolding at the gate. "Mr. Kamau," he said, extending his hand with profound respect and genuine warmth. "It's an honor to see you, sir. I didn't realize you'd be on my flight today." Mr. Kamau's face softened as he shook Foster's hand firmly. "James, good to see you. How's Sarah? Has your daughter finished medical school yet?" The captain beamed with paternal pride. "Yes, sir. Graduated top of her class last month from Johns Hopkins, thanks in no small part to the Meridian Scholarship Foundation. She still talks about the summer internship you arranged for her in our engineering department when she was considering aviation medicine." "Bright girl," Mr. Kamau nodded. "She'll make an excellent doctor. Please give her my congratulations." Charlotte stood frozen between them, her eyes widening as understanding dawned fully. The color had drained from her face completely, leaving her makeup standing out starkly against her pallor. Her hands, which had been so confidently crossed over her chest minutes earlier, now hung limply at her sides. Captain Foster turned to address her directly, his expression hardening. "Ms. Wilson, do you know who this gentleman is?" Charlotte swallowed visibly, unable to form words. The terminal had gone completely silent around them, hundreds of passengers watching the scene unfold as if it were a theatrical production. Before she could answer, Captain Foster continued, his voice carrying across the now silent terminal area with the authority of a man accustomed to commanding aircraft through storms. "This is Mr. David Kamau, founder and chairman of the board of Meridian Airways. He built this airline from 2 cargo planes into what it is today, the 5th largest carrier in the United States, employing over 63,000 people worldwide, including you and me." The captain gestured to the wall above the gate, where a small bronze plaque was mounted easy to miss unless one was looking for it. This entire terminal wing was named after him last year, in recognition of 50 years of contributions to American aviation. Charlotte's gaze followed his gesture, seeing for the first time the plaque she had passed hundreds of times without reading. The David N. Kamau Terminal. Aviation belongs to dreamers who do the work. The crowd gasped collectively. Several phones were raised higher to capture the moment. A few people actually applauded briefly before falling silent again, eager to see how the confrontation would resolve. "The man whose signature is on your paycheck," Captain Foster added quietly but firmly, "and who created the employee education program that paid for your management certificate last year." Charlotte's face crumpled in horrified realization. "Two didn't." "You didn't what?" Captain Foster asked, his tone controlled but sharp. "Didn't recognize him? Or didn't think someone who looks like Mr. Kamau could possibly belong in first class?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and damning. Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it, no words emerging. Ms. Reynolds stepped forward, her professional demeanor back in place after the initial shock of finding her former boss in this situation. Charlotte, we'll need to discuss this incident with HR immediately. Her voice was professional but ice-cold. This is completely unacceptable behavior toward any passenger, let alone our founder. Mr. Kamau raised his hand slightly. Margaret, perhaps we could. With all due respect, sir, Miss Black. Reynolds interrupted gently. Company protocol must be followed in situations like this. We've worked too hard building a culture of respect to allow such incidents to pass without formal review. She turned to Charlotte again. Ms. Wilson, please report to my office. Now. Charlotte stood speechless, her carefully maintained professional facade crumbling completely. Her mouth opened and closed without producing words, like a fish suddenly removed from water. Sweat beaded at her temples despite the terminal's powerful air conditioning. The crowd watched in tense silence, witnessing the real-time collapse of a career built on appearances and assumptions. Someone whispered, "That's going to leave a mark," and a nervous titter rippled through the onlookers. Mr. Kamau, I am so sorry. Charlotte finally managed, her voice barely audible. I didn't realize if I had known who you were. Mr. Kamau studied her face for a long moment. The terminal had gone completely silent, hundreds of passengers watching the scene unfold. Parents lifted small children to see better. Phones recorded from every angle. Tomorrow, this moment would be viewed millions of times across social media platforms, dissected and analyzed by strangers who would never know the full story of either person involved. That, he finally said, is precisely the problem, Ms. Wilson. His voice was soft, but carried weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. You shouldn't need to realize who someone is to treat them with basic human dignity. The words fell like stones into still water, rippling outward through the crowd. Several people nodded in agreement. An older black woman wiped a tear from her eye. The question, Mr. Kamau continued, his voice gentle but firm, is not whether I deserve respect because I built this airline. The question is whether you would have offered basic courtesy to any elderly person who dropped their cane, regardless of their ticket class, appearance, or accent. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears of humiliation. Sir, please me job. Is very much in jeopardy, Ms. Reynolds finished for her. She gestured to a security officer who had appeared nearby. Please escort Miss Wilson to my office. We'll need to complete the necessary paperwork. The security officer, a young Hispanic man who looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation, stepped forward. Ma'am, if you'll come with me, please. As Charlotte was led away, her shoulders slumped in defeat, her once perfect posture now a study in humiliation, Mr. Kamau called out, Ms. Wilson. She turned, hope flickering briefly across her face. We all make mistakes, he said, his voice carrying easily across the terminal. It's what we learn from them that defines us. For a moment, their eyes met the young woman whose assumptions had brought her low, and the elderly man whose decades of experience had taught him the power of both accountability and grace. Something passed between them, unspoken, but profound. With that, Mr. Kamau turned and walked toward the first-class lounge, the crowd parting respectfully before him. Captain Foster walked alongside, carrying Mr. Dotto B into Class Lounge. Kamau's small overnight bag that had been left on the floor during the confrontation. Ms. Reynolds followed a few steps behind, already making notes on her phone about the incident. As they disappeared into the lounge, the spell broke. The terminal erupted in conversation, passengers recounting what they'd just witnessed to those who had missed it. Within hours, videos of the encounter would go viral, Kamau respect trending across multiple platforms. A young black girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mom, who was that man? Her mother looked toward the lounge where Mr. Kamau had disappeared. That, sweetheart, is what real power looks like. Not yelling, not demanding, just knowing exactly who you are. 3 weeks later, David Kamau sat for a rare television interview in his modest office at Meridian's headquarters. Unlike the opulent executive suites favored by many CEOs, Kamau's workspace was functional and unpretentious, bookshelves filled with engineering texts and aviation history, a desk that had been with him since the company's founding, and walls adorned not with signs of his wealth, but with photographs of Meridian employees. Pilots, Flight attendants, baggage handlers, mechanics, gate agents, hundreds of faces smiled from the frames, each photo taken with Kamau during his regular visits to Meridian's hubs around the world. He knew many of their names, had attended their retirement parties, had written condolence letters when they lost loved ones. To him, they weren't employees, they were family. The interviewer Amanda Chen, a respected journalist known for her thoughtful profile, sat across from him, impressed by his lack of pretension. "Mr. Kamau," she began, "the video of your encounter with a Meridian flight attendant has been viewed over 20 million times. You've declined to comment until now. Many are calling for the employee's termination. What do you say to that?" Mr. Kamau folded his hands atop his cane, the brass bird catching the studio lights. "Firing Ms. Wilson would be easy," he said after a moment of consideration. "Teaching is harder, but infinitely more valuable." "So she still works for Meridian?" the interviewer asked, surprised. The public narrative had assumed immediate termination. "Ms. Wilson has been reassigned," Mr. Kamau explained. "She's currently working with our community outreach program, specifically with our initiative that provides free flights to elderly and disabled passengers who need to visit family but can't afford to travel." Amanda Chen nodded thoughtfully. "A lesson in empathy." "Precisely," Mr. Kamau smiled. "When I came to this country 60 years ago, I was judged daily by my appearance, my accent, my name. I remember applying for my first engineering position. My credentials were impeccable, but the interviewer couldn't get past how I pronounced aluminum differently. He suggested I apply for janitorial work instead." He paused, looking out the window at the planes bearing his company's logo taking off and landing in perfect choreography. "I promised myself that if I ever built something of value, it would be founded on respect for every individual, regardless of their external packaging." He tapped his cane gently on the floor for emphasis. "We transport humans, Ms. Cheno, cattle, not cargo. Humans with dignity, with stories, with worth that has nothing to do with the ticket class they can afford." "That's a powerful perspective," Amanda acknowledged. "But surely there are business realities. Premium services exist for a reason." Mr. Kamau nodded. "Of course, we charge more for certain amenities, certain comforts, but basic human dignity, being seen, being heard, being treated with respect, that should never be tiered pricing." His voice took on a forceful quality that reminded Amanda why this soft-spoken man had built an empire. "Courtesy should be universal, from the CEO in 1A to the student in the last row of economy. We've also implemented a new training module for all Meridian staff," he continued. "It's called the Invisible VIP, a reminder that every person who steps onto our aircraft or into our terminals deserves the same respect we would show to a celebrity or politician." "And Ms. Wilson is involved in developing this training?" Amanda asked. "Indeed. Her perspective is valuable precisely because she made this mistake so publicly. She's working with our training department to incorporate her experience into case studies for new hires." "That's an unusual approach," Amanda observed. "Most companies would have terminated her immediately, if only for PR reasons." Mr. Kamau leaned forward slightly. "That would have been expedient, but not educational, not transformative." His eyes held a gentle intensity. "Ms. Wilson is not a bad person. She's a product of a society that teaches us to make snap judgments based on appearance, accent, age. Breaking that habit requires more than punishment, it requires reflection and growth." "And what about the scholarship fund you announced last week?" the interviewer asked, shifting topics. Mr. Kamau's eyes brightened. "Ah, yes, the Dignity First Scholarship. We're providing full college funding for 50 students from underserved communities each year. The selection criteria emphasize character and community service over test scores or extracurricular achievements." "And I understand Miss Wilson will be helping to select the recipients?" "Indeed, she has shown remarkable growth these past weeks. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest transformations." He smiled slightly. "When I spoke with her last week, she told me something profound. She said, 'I've spent 8 years looking at passengers as ticket classes rather than people. I never realized how dehumanizing that was for them and for me.'" "Has she faced backlash from the public?" Amanda asked. "Considerable," Mr. Kamau acknowledged with a frown. "Social media can be merciless. People sent her death threats, called her employer, posted her personal information online. The very people claiming to stand for dignity were denying her the same. How did you address that? I issued a statement asking for compassion. I reminded people that none of us would want to be judged solely by our worst moment. Growth requires grace. Amanda nodded thoughtfully. You've turned what could have been a simple HR issue into a teachable moment for your entire organization and beyond. Mr. Kamau shrugged slightly. When you reach my age, Miss Chen, you realize that everything is a teachable moment if you're willing to see it that way. 6 months later, Gate 12 at Kennedy International Airport had been completely renovated. What had once been a standard boarding area had been transformed into something more thoughtful and inclusive. The traditional separation between regular boarding lines and first-class lines remained, but the space had been redesigned to feel less hierarchical. The carpet that had once marked the premium area now extended throughout the entire gate area. The harsh overhead lighting had been replaced with warmer fixtures that created a more welcoming atmosphere. As passengers approached the boarding area, they passed by a new installation of bronze plaque bearing David Kamau's image and a quote, "Respect costs nothing, but its absence destroys everything. David Kamau, founder, Meridian Airways." Below the plaque stood a simple wooden bench with another small inscription, "Rest here and be seen for who you truly are." The bench was positioned such that anyone sitting on it could be easily seen by gate agents and flight attendants. Subtle reminder to staff to acknowledge every passenger. It was crafted from the same Kenyan ironwood as Mr. Kamau's cane, a connection most passengers would never know, but that gave him quiet satisfaction whenever he passed through. The first person to sit on that bench each morning was Charlotte Wilson, now dressed in a different uniform, that of Meridian's Community Ambassador program. The pale blue blazer and comfortable slacks had replaced the more rigid flight attendant uniform, just as her newly relaxed demeanor had replaced her former rigidity. Her job now was to greet elderly and disabled passengers, help families with young children, and ensure that everyone, regardless of ticket class, felt valued from the moment they entered the terminal. The 6 months since the incident, as it was now known throughout the company, had transformed her in ways she never could have anticipated. The viral video had nearly destroyed her. She'd received death threats, been doxxed online, and faced a torrent of abuse on social media. For weeks, she couldn't leave her apartment without being recognized and confronted. Her parents in Wisconsin had received hateful phone calls. Former classmates had contacted news outlets with unflattering stories from her past. She had expected to be fired immediately. When Mr. Kamau instead offered her a pathway to redemption, she had been skeptical, at first convinced it was a PR stunt that would end as soon as the media attention faded. But he had been sincere. He had invited her to his office for a 3-hour conversation that changed her life. He hadn't lectured her. Instead, he had asked questions and truly listened to her answers. "What did you see when you looked at me that day?" he had asked. "An elderly man who didn't look like he belonged in first class," she had admitted, ashamed, but determined to be honest. "And what do you think shaped that perception?" The question had led her down a path of self-reflection she had never traveled before. She began to examine the assumptions she made daily about passengers, about colleagues, about strangers on the street. She started noticing patterns in her thinking that had been invisible to her before. Now, 6 months later, she greeted passengers with genuine warmth rather than practiced professionalism. She had learned the names of the regular business travelers, remembered the dietary restrictions of frequent flyers, and kept small toys in her pocket for anxious children. And occasionally, when Mr. Kamau passed through on his way to board meetings in other cities, he would stop and sit beside her for a few minutes. They never spoke of that day, but their quiet conversations about family, dreams, and second chances said everything that needed to be said. "My daughter's starting college next fall," Charlotte told him one morning in late October as they watched the sun rise through the terminal's eastern windows. "She's applying for the Dignity First Scholarship." Mr. Kamau nodded. "The application process is rigorous but fair. I don't intervene personally." "I wouldn't want you to," Charlotte replied quickly. "She needs to earn it on her own merits." She paused. "But if she doesn't get it, I'm still proud of her essay. She wrote about what she learned from my mistake, about how watching me face consequences and grow from them taught her more than any success could have." Mr. Kamau smiled at that. Children learn from what we do, not what we say. My father used to say the same thing, Charlotte admitted. I think I finally understand what he meant. In the grand choreography of the busy airport, their bench became a small island of humanity, a place where harried travelers could pause, where staff could remember the purpose behind their protocols, where dignity was offered freely to all who passed by. And David Kamau, now in his 77th year, continued to dress simply, walk slowly with his cane, and speak softly when addressing others. But now, throughout Meridian's global network, every employee knew his face not because they feared him, but because his presence reminded them of the foundation upon which the airline was built. Dignity is not earned, it is inherent, and recognizing it in others is the greatest form of first-class service anyone can provide. 1 year to the day after the incident, Charlotte Wilson stood at Gate 12, greeting passengers for the morning flight to Chicago. Her hair, once rigidly styled, now fell in natural waves around her face. The severe makeup she had once worn like armor had been replaced by a more minimal approach that allowed her natural freckles to show through. As she checked in an elderly couple, ensuring they had wheelchair assistance arranged at their destination, she noticed a young black man approaching tentatively. He was perhaps 20, dressed simply in jeans and a Cornell University sweatshirt, carrying a well-worn backpack. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness. "Is this where I check in for flight 237 to Chicago?" "Yes, it is." Charlotte smiled warmly. "May I see your boarding pass?" The young man handed her his phone with a digital ticket displayed. "It's my first time flying," he admitted. "I'm a little nervous." Charlotte checked his information. "Well, Mr. Isaiah Washington, you're all set. You're in seat 12. That's a window seat over the wing. Many people find that's the smoothest part of the aircraft if you're concerned about turbulence." The young man nodded gratefully. "Thank you. That's good to know." Something about his name tickled a memory in Charlotte's mind. "Washington. Are you by any chance a Dignity First scholar?" His face lit up with surprise. "Yes. How did you know?" Charlotte smiled. "I serve on the selection committee. Your essay was exceptional about growing up in Southside Chicago and creating a STEM mentorship program for middle school students." The young man blushed slightly. "Thank you. That scholarship changed my life. I'm actually flying to Chicago to speak at my old middle school about college opportunities." "That's wonderful," Charlotte said sincerely. "Mr. Kamau would be very proud. He's particularly passionate about educational outreach." "Do you think I might meet him someday?" Isaiah asked, his eyes wide with hope. "His story inspired me ever since I read about him in middle school. A Kenyan immigrant who built an airline empire. It made me believe I could do something meaningful too." "I think that's very possible," Charlotte replied, noticing a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the first-class lounge. "In fact—" "Good morning, Charlotte," said Mr. Kamau, arriving at the gate with his characteristic unhurried pace. "Beautiful day for flying." Charlotte smiled. "Good morning, sir. May I introduce Isaiah Washington? He's one of your Dignity First scholars, heading to Chicago to speak at his former middle school." Mr. Kamau's face brightened as he extended his hand to the young man. "Mr. Washington, I remember your application. Very impressive work you're doing with those students." Isaiah seemed momentarily starstruck, then gathered himself and shook Mr. Panes. Kamau's hand firmly. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you. Your story inspired me to pursue engineering. I never imagined I'd actually get to thank you in person." "The honor is mine," Mr. Kamau replied. "Young people like you are why we created the scholarship in the first place." He glanced at Charlotte with a warm smile. "Good things often emerge from unexpected places, wouldn't you agree, Ms. Wilson?" Charlotte nodded, thinking of the journey that had brought them all to this dropped cane, a public humiliation, and the grace that had transformed it into something healing and constructive. "They certainly do, sir," she replied. "They certainly do." As the three of them stood talking, the airline founder, the ambassador who had learned the hard way about dignity, and the young scholar whose life had been changed by their intersection, the morning sunlight streamed through the terminal windows, illuminating the plaque on the wall. "Respect costs nothing, but its absence destroys everything. True wealth, Mr. Kamau reflected as he observed the bustling terminal bearing his name had never been about the billions in his bank account. It was about the connections formed, the dignity affirmed, and the circle of respect that continued expanding outward, touching lives he would never even know. He adjusted his grip on his Kenneth brass bird, still gleaming after all these years, and prepared to board yet another flight on the airline he had built from nothing but determination and a dream too stubborn to die. Behind him, Charlotte Wilson continued greeting passengers, seeing each one fully now, not as ticket classes or boarding groups, but as humans carrying their own stories, their own dreams, their own inherent dignity. And before them both stretched the future, a sky full of possibilities for everyone brave enough to claim their rightful place in it.